Good evening. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with Dave Frank. This is Redwood Wonk, and we are going to talk national news of the day, but we're going to start off with the California primaries. We'll report a little bit on the results and talk a bit about their national significance. I will just start off by saying it was a very low turnout so far, although not all the ballots are accounted for because we have so many that were mail-in ballots, and anything that came in, I think it was after Thursday, has not yet been counted. Only the same day ballots that have been, and as well as the older ballots have been counted. So we're still waiting on it. For instance, in Humboldt County, some of these races, a couple of these races aren't done yet because there's anywhere from 10 to 20,000 ballots left that still have to be processed. Apparently, a big chunk come in that late, and then other things. So this is a big deal because what I find fascinating is that the Democratic statewide candidates did very well, despite the fact that this was a lower turnout. If you look at the turnout map at the Secretary of State office, you will find, website, you'll find that turnout was higher in the red areas, the Republican areas, which means Republicans were turning out at higher rates than Democrats. But at this point, I think there are about twice as many Democrats as there are Republicans in the state. So despite a low Democratic turnout, the Democrats all still did very well last night in the statewide races, and are looking strong to win in November. Gavin Newsom, so whatever happened to him last summer in that recall event, he came back strong. I believe at this point he is he is at 56.6%, and will go up against Brian Dale, a Republican from the northeastern part of the state, which is really the only portion of the state that had any counties which went for the Republican. The rest of the what do you call, the constitutional statewide positions pretty much went the same way. I mean, Shirley Weber for Secretary of State got 63%. I think she did the best of all of them. And then there are some like the controller, which the Republican is actually in the lead, Lan He Chen, but with 33% of the vote. But there were five other candidates, four of which were Democrats and one which was the Green Party. And it's pretty well expected that although he's got 33% of the vote and she's got Malia Cohen has got 27% of the vote, that she's going to collect the bulk of those votes. And then probably, because more Democrats will turn out in November, she'll probably win. But this part of the reason this is happening is that the controller, Betty Yee, got into some scandal trouble enough that the LA Times came out with the goofiest endorsement in the world. Basically, they were endorsing the Republican over the Democrats to punish the Democrats for Betty Yee, as if the other Democrats had anything to do with her controversy. But a similar situation with the insurance commissioner, although Ricardo Lara is in first place, but there were some controversies with him as well. But everybody else was doing really well. And then we have the congressional races, which are really important because the Democrats, although they're expected to lose in other parts of the country, in California, because of the ability to get them out, get voters out, although they didn't really take advantage of it this time around, but will be expected to in November, because everybody's going to be mail-in a ballot. There'll be phone calls, just as there were in the recall election, to get your ballot off of your desk or your dresser or wherever and get it into the mail. And that we'll see if that works better for them in November when they spend more resources on it rather than in that. But I will report on some of those races. But before we go on, I would like to see, Dave, would you like to comment on the statewide position races?
Well, I would just say one thing, which it was sort of an unstated premise in how you described it, is that for those races, because of the way California law is structured, the top two candidates will end up going on to face off in the November primary. So a lot of the sort of horse race, the actual numbers are a little bit less important. So, for example, like if there's the race that you described where the Republican was in the lead, I think it was the controller.
Yes.
But when you realize that person's only got 35-ish% of the vote, and then we'll square off with some other combination. So I think that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, it was surprising. I think that or maybe not so surprising. People were predicting a very low turnout, and I think we just about matched what people were saying. They were expecting about 30% of the eligible voters, and I think when we ended up going off air last night, we had only gotten about 15% or so of the vote in. So
18% in Humboldt County, but yeah, Humboldt County. But
gotcha. Yeah. But you said there's still another 10 or 20,000 votes out there, which means that the turnout wasn't quite so bad.
Not real bad, not great, but not real bad either. I do think inflation and a few other things are kind of keeping the trend down. Also, want to point out that due to our unique primary system, we do not have parties each putting up their own candidates, so that leaves open a lot of possibilities of both of the runoff winners, because the top two vote getters run off against each other. And for instance, Insurance Commissioner Ricardo Lara has just about 40% of the vote, and Mark Levine has 18% of the vote. They're both Democrats. So there could be two Democrats running off against each other. And if there is dissatisfaction with Ricardo Lara, even though he's well out in front at this point, he does need to be concerned about the fact that he's got under 40% of the vote and he's the incumbent.
I do have one other thing at the state level in California is a previous Democratic state legislator from the Bay Area is Rob Bonta, for Attorney General, and there was a national narrative surrounding Chesa Boudin from San Francisco, the DA, which I'm sure you're going to talk about in a minute. But there was talk of that this might be an election where progressives take a real big hit, and that type of sort of progressive interpretation of law enforcement that was somehow against the tide of history or a really bad time to be progressive. So Rob Bonta was not tied to the sentiment that we saw in San Francisco. So I just wanted to say at the state level, there was, again, close to 60% success for incumbents, Democrats.
Yeah, although it's hard to say what the sentiment is with Bonta because his opponents, Nathan Hochman, is a little extreme in some ways. So there's or unpopular. So he might have benefited from that as well. But definitely, we'll talk about the San Francisco briefly, but because they did have a recall of their DA. We're running out of time on this topic, but yes, the DA was recalled, and we'll talk about that actually another time because I do want to talk about this movement of progressive DAs and how this was bad timing for them. But because we only have a couple minutes left in this one, I want to get down to the congressional races because this is where the Democrats are hoping to pick up 3 or 4 seats in the House because of our ability to push turnouts because of the new voting system. And David Valadao, moderate Republican, appears to be in a little bit of trouble in his redistricted district. Rudy Salas, a new Democrat to the scene, has gotten 51% of the vote to Valadao's 25%. And he may have a problem because that has become a very Democratic-leaning district, the Republican that is. In the 27th district, I'm going to just skip a couple. My prediction for Young Kim is wrong. She did make it into the runoff, but she is behind Asif Mahmood, who has about 40% of the vote. And so she's going to have a hard time winning re-election, but she did make it into the runoff. Several others. Mark Levine, they thought might have had some problems. Pardon me, Mike Levine. Mark Levine is a different candidate. Mike Levine in the 49th district, but he got, it looks like 55% of the vote and is looking like he's going to win pretty handily. But there are several other districts in which the Republicans' fates, because of the redistricting and because of this new voting system, they may be in jeopardy, and this could be where the Democrats actually pick up members of the House.
You were talking about the big picture. I'll say one last thing is that up through this last night, more than half of Republican nominees who won their primary either denied the legitimacy of the 2020 election or raised doubts about it. So, that's a theme that we'll pick up on again in the future. There's 20 important races in California, maybe 3 or 4 that could flip, and we'll learn lessons from that as we go down the road. Yeah.
All right. That brings us to the next topic.
On a bright school morning, Alyssa went out to greet the day. Tossed her soccer bag in the back seat of the car, thinking about the game she would play. Now we see her picture in the paper, and her big brown eyes seem to say, "You've got blood on your hands. You just stand by while children die. You've got blood on your hands. Money means more to you than living people do. Blood on your hands."
Okay, last week we both have agreed that the gun discussion would go nowhere as usual, but it does look like there's some hope that something will be passed. It'll probably be moderate or even mild and thoroughly inadequate, but but the fact that even anything might be passed because of the recent rash of deaths, particularly the children in Texas, but also others. That some Republicans are feeling the pressure to at least look like they're doing something, and the Democrats are pushing for that. And Mitch McConnell actually said, "Yeah, we're open to passing something," which brought in strong criticism from Marjorie Taylor Greene and the the fringe of the Republican Party on that. But there is some talk that maybe there's going to be some type of movement on this, whether it's some type of red flag law that we discussed last time, some moderate, some expansion of the background checks, or something not likely to lead to any banning or restriction of particular gun categories anymore. They're just the Republicans just seem dead set against that, but they're looking for something that they can say they did something in the upcoming election, because the Democrats are expected to push them on this, especially as the killings just don't seem to be stopping. There's a mass killing every day, at least 3 people, So, but where they are and will anything pass, or will the NRA push and say no change whatsoever? We don't want to open the door even a little bit. It's hard to say, but it seems a little more likely than it did last week. Dave?
I definitely agree with your angle where you said that the Republican Party appears to have realized that they need to pass something, or at least be seen to participate in a conversation, but it's on a very short leash, those negotiations. So
yes.
Mitch McConnell appointed Senator John Cornyn to lead the Republican negotiations, and he is a tightly I guess a widely believed person that might aspire to potentially lead the Senate one day. So there's very limited room for anything remotely progressive or in alignment with what the Democrats have put into some of their bills. So this is seen, a couple of the commentators have said that, raising the age to purchase an AR-15 is going to be off the table, but allowing juvenile records into the FBI crime database is something that might be reasonable for them. That they're thinking, and I think McConnell's quote was something like, "We'd like to get a deal related directly to the subject matter." So they literally are talking about one event in Texas, young person, potentially there were some flags, and we could go a little bit farther. But one of the things that was also said was that a red flag law, if a red flag law was put in place, that it wouldn't be compulsory, that there would be incentives. They don't want to compel states to expand background checks. They don't want to compel states to have red flag laws. They're signaling that they want states, that the federalism argument is to allow states a lot of flexibility.
And a lot of this is coming from the pressure is coming from hearings that have been held, including a very, very disturbing and horrible testimony of a surviving kid who had to play dead and rub blood from his classmates onto himself to look like he was dead in order to survive. Very resourceful in that moment. But God, something like that for somebody that age to go through. I mean, it's just it's incredible. And so Republicans are under a little bit of pressure here. But then you get John Thune coming out, talking to the press and saying, we need our AR-15s, people in my state using them to shoot prairie dogs. I mean, what? It's just, you really need a semi-automatic assault weapon to shoot a prairie dog? I mean, I guess, there are, I did look up in the comic books, there are some mutant prairie dogs that look like they might be a threat. I was thinking of using that as a graphic, but this is too serious a matter. And for him to say something like that, it was just, but so, have they learned their lesson? I don't know, but this is, but there does seem to be a shift. But we've heard this before. Oh, there's a shift back when Obama was trying to get it. Yes, this is different from the talks before, and they still run into dead ends.
Yeah. And I'll just add, too, that there are other angles. There are other paths in theory besides what Cornyn is negotiating. So like Lindsey Graham is negotiating with Senator Richard Blumenthal, who's a Democrat. Lindsey's a Republican, of course. Richard Blumenthal's a Democrat. Yeah. They reintroduced or are talking about reintroducing the federal extreme risk protection order. So it's an existing red flag law that's out there that's got some degree of bipartisan support. Of course, McConnell and his surrogate might try to block it. Similarly, Pat Toomey, Republican from Pennsylvania, is working with Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, and they're talking about expanding background checks at gun shows and over the internet with an exception for transfers between friends and family. So that is actually something that I think, thoughtful people have said, if we're going to do something, we should do that, close that gun show loophole, which in theory, I've heard other people say that it's really a private transfer protection that the NRA is not going to let anybody bend on, but I think that's at least one thoughtful alternative. And if for what it's worth, it seems reasonable. We've talked about this at other places, other times, but the survey data going back I think 10 years or more shows that the vast majority of Americans do support background checks for all gun transfers, even NRA members. It's over 70%. I think it's closer to 75% of NRA members want background checks for gun transfers, all gun transfers.
Even if it's a gift to your spouse or something, there should be a background check, period. End of story.
Yeah. So it's a small constituency for people that maybe have for whatever reason have committed a violent crime or committed a felony, and they fear that that's going to prevent them from now that they've served their time or done restitution, that they'd be prevented. So if there are safety measures in place for people who say, well, I've done something in the past, but I've made amends, and so reasonable negotiators, if they were actually looking for a way to carve out the necessary exceptions and extensions of privileges.
But the hypocrisy on that one is amazing, because in some of these same states where these people are saying, oh, we can't ban them from owning guns for a lifetime, they don't allow them to vote if they've been convicted of a felony. Right. I mean, come on. You can't have it both ways. And of course that's to keep black people from voting. That's the whole motivation. I'm sorry behind that rule, and because they are higher in other progressive constituencies, including working class. In my view, if you're convicted of domestic violence, that should be a lifetime ban. I'm sorry, but I have a different approach to this, and the reason there's big opposition to that is because there are a number of police officers who sometimes are convicted of domestic violence, and they would not be allowed to be police officers anymore. Cry me a river. I'm sorry. Don't do that. Then don't. Their line is usually, well, then don't do the crime if you don't want to, do the time. Well,
Right.
Fine, but why are you making guns the one exception to your law and order position? I'll let you close this out.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the civic death penalty, which is that people can't vote in some states if they've ever committed a felony. I think that's something that raises to the level of, there's a thing that's called log rolling, which is you give a little here, the other party gives a little there, and you're able to get some. Maybe it's the sum is less than the whatever the total sum is less valuable than the value of the parts, but that's how the sausage gets made, but not in DC in the current power structure. And with Cornyn, like my takeaway here is that with Cornyn being the point person, he's not eligible for re-election until not eligible, he's not up for re-election until 2026. He's probably going to block just about everything that doesn't get approved by the NRA.
All right. Well, we'll be discussing that if anything does happen or if it doesn't. Next topic.
Well, let me give you my view of what happened January the 6th. It was a violent insurrection for the purpose of trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power after a legitimately certified election from one administration to the next. That's what it was. With regard to the suggestion that the RNC should be in the business of picking and choosing Republicans who ought to be supported, traditionally the view of the National Party committees is that we support all members of our party, regardless of their positions on some issues. The issue is whether or not the RNC should be sort of singling out members of our party who may have different views from the majority. That's not the job of the RNC.
Okay, there is news in the January 6th hearing. January 6th committee is set hearings, and there's expected to be testimony. There's been a lot of depositions that have taken place. People who were resisting it have done so. There is, as we discussed last week, there are people under indictment for refusing to honor the subpoenas, which is the guy who was like yelling after he came out. He was like complaining because it was about to enter an airplane. I'm trying to remember which one it was. It wasn't Meadows. It was the other one, who was about to enter an airplane. He was putting handcuffs brought in and is complaining that, the law applies to him. God, I'm forgetting. Anyway.
Yeah, I didn't hear this one.
Yeah, it was last week. And then he
Peter Navarro? Is that
what's Navarro, that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
And he's facing charges of contempt of Congress for refusing to honor the subpoena. Like any one of the rest of us would go to jail, but he wants special treatment. Anyway, that's the news. There is that, but they probably have most of the documents they need, and they're going to move forward with hearings. And there's a lot of discussion about what if impact they're going to have. Is this a political stunt for the election? Are they timing it for the election to influence it? And David Brooks, who is sort of a conservative, but actually kind of liberal in a lot of ways, maybe from being on PBS all the time, and having discussions with Mark Shields and and the rest. But he's very enlightened, and he says that January 6th blew it. They shouldn't have stalled this to wait for it to try to impact the election. They should have gotten it out as soon as possible. I says, if they're trying to basically tarnish Trump, Trump. We've gone 6 years of incredible stuff. If he's not tarnished now, he's not going to be tarnished. It's not going to be the silver bullet. And so what are they, with inflation and everything else happening, is it even going to be on voters' minds? And however, you pointed out, well, I'll let you talk about a couple of icons on this kind of thing have had something to say.
Yeah, so leading up to this week, there have been some leaks here and there, and people were fearful that the American public's not paying attention, or that they're not sufficiently concerned. So something that really was released very recently in the last couple of days that really draws people's attention to what's about to happen, or what may have, how we were going to frame the hearings. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who were famous for being the Washington Post journalists who reported on the Nixon administration's corruption that ultimately led to him leaving office in disgrace. They're known, obviously, uncovering Watergate scandal. That's pretty much the deal. Well, they came out with an op-ed in the Washington Post that said that Trump committed. Here's the quote. So firstly, that he conspired to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. Bob Woodward said, "I'm convinced that Donald Trump conspired to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power," which makes him the first president to be seditious in the history of our country. And that was a warning. There was a warning from President George Washington about how corruptible men could, in theory, seize power, and that was a fear that George Washington had for our country. But Woodward and Bernstein in their op-ed said that Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election was something not even President Richard Nixon would have imagined. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's why I think that's the gravity of what we're looking at. And I could get into some of the things that people can expect to hear, but I'll let you if you want to keep going here.
We can talk about that. The hearings, I believe, are supposed to start tomorrow, right? Thursday.
Yeah.
So
and we're sessions, up to 6 sessions.
Right, and they have said they're going to release previously unreleased material. That was announced by Adam Schiff in a press conference. I know that there's a little bit of division within it, not mild division, but Liz Cheney, one of the two Republicans on the in the committee, has said that has encouraged the rest of the committee not to overreach or overextend, such as calling for an end to the electoral college system or anything like that. We'll see what they do. They probably aren't going to propose that. They probably don't want to keep that separate anyway. But and I'll be curious to see who actually speaks. You can talk to that too. And will they call in any constitutional experts or any law enforcement experts? I have not taken a look at actually who is going to be testifying. They will be reading from the transcripts of depositions they've taken, and probably including the Trump family, where some have been taken. But we'll let you comment on what's going to be in it.
So the big picture, I think, like Liz Cheney had said, they don't want to overreach. Representative Raskin, Democrat from Maryland, one of the things that he said was that the goal of this committee is about democratic resiliency. Can we fortify our institutions and our people against, this is a quote, against insurrection, coups, and violence? And he's saying, I hope we'll be able to spur the country to make the necessary reforms to solidify the democracy. So what that means is the Electoral Count Act, what it means in part, is that the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which says that the whole transfer of power comes down to one day when the vice president gets presented with electors and accepts them, that ritual is a very easy ritual to disrupt. It can be disrupted at the state level. It can be disrupted in person. It can be disrupted with the corruption of a vice president. So that the approach is to tell a story. Their approach is to tell the story. They're going to show videos, and they're going to make a compelling case that there was a far-flung effort, that they've got immense amounts of evidence, including really damning texts that went to Mark Meadows. Yes. So they're going to string together that story and really try to make the case that they can move the needle of public perception, that the public, that the national audience will be sufficiently alarmed, sufficiently shocked, if that's even possible anymore, that something must be done. And so, not to overstate this, but there's star witnesses are staff members of Vice President Pence, senior advisors, attorney, and I don't know if they're both attorneys, but at least one of them are, Mark Short and Greg Jacobs. So some of the things that they've said publicly, some of the things that have leaked out, it was clear there was a Secret Service person detail attached to President Trump, spoke to a Secret Service detail person attached to Vice President Pence. It was clear to the Pence people that there was a concerted effort to stop the election, and they did. They chose to keep Vice President Pence on the premises despite the risk to his, health and well-being. So that's the story they really want to tell. One last thing, which I think I'll mention here, and then I'll turn it over to you, is that there's a specialist named Denver Riggleman. He's a senior technical advisor to the committee, and his team actually put together a package of these texts, which I think are again supposed to really, maybe he was engaged in hyperbole, but the idea is that there were massive amounts of people communicating with Mark Meadows the day before, leading up to, the moments after, that Trump really was the hub of a larger conspiracy. That's the case they're trying to make.
Yeah. Again, they have to make it too, not just about Trump, but about the big lie. I think they need to really promote the fact that that this is a belief that they spread. I mean, it probably even more damage than the insurrection itself was the whipping up the anger around this belief for the weeks ahead of time that this election was stolen. And there are, as you noted in the previous segment, more than half of the winners of primaries, Republican primaries, believe the big lie. I'm not even sure I believe that. I believe they're stating that they believe the big lie. I don't think, for instance, Vance in Ohio, who wrote the hillbilly elegy, is actually believes that. He's too smart. Right. But he's taking that position because it's necessary to not alienate the Trump voters in Ohio. And so, that is undermining the confidence in the institutions. And without the confidence in the institutions become weaker. And that needs to be the point.
Friends, I'm proud to greet you from Ukraine, from our capital city of Kyiv, a city that is under missile and airstrikes from Russian troops every day, but it doesn't give up. And I have the honor to greet you on behalf of the Ukrainian people, brave and freedom-loving people who for 8 years have been resisting the Russian aggression. Those who give their best sons and daughters to stop this full-scale Russian invasion. Right now, the destiny of our country is being decided. The destiny of our people.
Okay, this segment, we're returning to the Ukraine war. A lot of developments. Actually, the war, there seems to be a little bit of a stalemate on the ground. Technically speaking, Russian forces have made some incremental gains in the east. There's some street-by-street fighting in a couple of the major cities in that area. The Ukrainians are trying to take pressure off it by an offensive down by Kherson in the south that has forced Russian forces to. So, that's all the technical stuff going on, but there's no immediate end to the war. And last week, President Biden said explicitly, this war is going to ultimately end in a negotiated agreement. And he said at the same time he's never going to put any pressure on Ukrainian leadership to cede any territory. So that makes you wonder then what is going to be the basis of a negotiated settlement. It's real hard. Well, The Ukrainians have been getting more weapons of all sorts today, and I'm seeing all kinds of those films of Italian machine guns and German helmets and a lot of different rockets coming from Sweden, from other countries, and the rest. And the United States has already delivered its Switchblade drones and is possibly going to send, I forget what they are, the killer something drones that have a big payload that they can attack.
The Gray Eagles.
The Gray Eagles, that's it. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether or not that's going to lead to an escalation. But this is happening. And it's to basically give Ukraine longer range. They're getting more artillery. They've gotten artillery from France and us and several other countries that is more accurate and has a bigger range than some of the previous items. Also, today, that we saw that they put together a MiG-29 that had not been in operation since 2018 because of the parts that were delivered to them, in which the United States informed the public at one point in April that this would lead to at least 20 new planes, which makes a lot of people wonder if those aren't 20 of the planes that Poland had that being dismantled and re-put together there later. But at any rate, there's a lot more activity from the Ukraine Air Force. Dogfights over Kherson and attacks is on Snake Island and possible attacks extending into Crimea if this happens. The Russians are obviously concerned because for the first time in over a month they sent missiles into business and residential areas of Kyiv.
Exactly.
And so they're trying to send a warning, don't send these weapons, blah, blah, blah. But the weapons are on their way. It's going to happen. And is that going to be a turning point to help Ukraine push the Russians back? Do the Russians? I'm not even convinced that that's the goal of the Ukrainians. I think the Ukrainian army retreats strategically because their mission is to destroy tanks and kill Russians. I mean, that's a guerrilla warfare, semi-guerrilla warfare, and in order to make the invasion unsustainable at this point, as we reported about a month ago, because of all of the international boycotts of Russia, Russia is currently unable to replace its T-70 tanks, its primary tanks. So every tank that gets destroyed or stolen by the Ukrainians, by the tractor brigade, is a lost tank, period. They cannot replace them, and they don't even make the T-90s anymore. So they've got problems. And so the question is this going to, what is going to be the impact of now the fact that they are getting longer range weapons, rockets, precision rockets, as long as they promise not to send them into Russia?
Yeah, so that's how you frame this for us, and I appreciate the backstory here. So this is a question of connecting the dots. I think that your point that Russia chose to strike at Kiev for the first time in a long time, that's telling. I think the dominoes are kind of lined up where there's been massive international outcry about the blockade of the ports. Food is not getting distributed. I think the number's like 41 of the developing countries are experiencing hunger. Yes. They get significant percentages of their substance from Russia and Ukraine. So there's a global famine or at least a hunger crisis on the horizon. I think that is the international law pretext for a lot of the escalation that we're seeing. The fact that these drones have been committed, there's only 4 so far, but these drones, this particular drone we talked about back in the prior wars, we talked about Predator drones and their capacity, their capability. Yes. That's like 3 generations old, but 1 generation or 2 generations old are these Gray Eagles, and so just they can fly over 24 hours. So just a couple of those have. A set of 4 can do perpetual surveillance over very broad areas, and they have precision targeting and coordinating capacity. So
and large payloads of.
But I'm saying they actually have 8 air-to-air defense weapons that they can use to shoot down other drones and other airplanes. They have 4 air-to-ground where they can target just about anything. And those precision weapons that they're able to help target. So what my point is that the logistics and the capacity to really escalate the precision, that expands out to the sea. So Ukraine already has, or will have in the next week, or certainly in the next 4 weeks, the capacity to take out the entirety of the Russian Navy off the coast with the effective push of a button. I don't know if you and I have talked about this before, but really that's why I think President Macron of France made the statement, "Let's not humiliate Russia," because that's really what we're talking about. The idea is to force a settlement, forced diplomacy. Biden has said it himself. He published it in an op-ed. The idea that we could make the issue on the ground so uncomfortable for Russia that their peace will be on Ukraine's terms. And the United States and NATO and the Western alliance can, in fact, use the blockade as a pretext to continue pumping this amount of money into combat. So your question is it escalating? I think it's escalating immensely. I think we're a lot close, and I hate to be that person, but I think we're a lot closer to I don't want to say a tipping point.
Confrontation with NATO.
Yeah, like a really uncomfortable confrontation, because Russia can read the tea leaves. They know what capacity is potentially. Now, granted, Biden and the United States and the West has been slow rolling this, signaling we're going to do a little bit here, a little bit there, and enhance the capacity slowly in a defensive posture. But if the mandate changes even slightly, then like I said, I think, in response to your original question, is it an escalation? I think it's an escalation that is sort of beyond people's capacity to understand the magnitude of. When the command and control is that precise, it's a completely different defensive position that Ukraine finds itself in, assuming that these drones get rolled out and that these missiles get rolled out.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be harder for Russian military and Putin to claim victory.
Exactly.
If these things are happening.
Exactly.
That was and it's possible at this point that that's what they wanted to do: claim victory and then agree to withdraw everything except Crimea.
And not to interrupt you, but that connection that they just did is secure in the last 48 hours to connect from Russia by land over to Crimea. That might be that and Luhansk. They've got 97% control of Luhansk. I mean, the conditions on the ground already are ripe for a negotiated peace, but the question is, will that happen? And I just wonder.
Yeah, I don't know either. Boris Johnson had, there's got to be some unified, approach policy from the West, because Boris Johnson encouraged Zelensky to abandon the talks, and everybody else was like, why? Maybe everybody else was hoping he would have lost his no confidence vote on Monday, but it's just at any rate, it is a tricky situation, but a lot of grain getting out of Ukraine would be good for the international economy.
And before I forget, Turkey, who I would call a bad faith actor right now, unfortunately, they have engaged in negotiations with Russia about opening a shipping corridor in exchange for lifting sanctions. And the West does not seem prepared to do that. So that negotiation is probably not something that's going to be ripe yet, but that's at least a hopeful potential avenue for negotiation.
Considering the most deadly drones that Ukraine had came from Turkey before now.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll be talking a lot more about that in future shows.
I don't think I've made mistakes. I mean, every time somebody says I made a mistake, they do the polls and my numbers go up. So I guess I haven't made any mistakes.
We showed up and we demonstrated that we would not have our voices silenced by a Republican Party that across the country had a singular intention on suppressing the right to vote.
Some Democratic senators seem to imagine they could just break the rules on a razor-thin majority. Nothing would stand between them and their entire agenda, a new era of fast-track policymaking.
The Republican Party moved very far away from reality. And And the fact that you got colleagues of mine in the Senate who refuse even today to acknowledge that Donald Trump lost the election. How do you deal with that?
Joe Biden is the president we need right now. Battle-tested, forward-looking, honest and authentic. He has never forgotten who he is fighting for.
Okay, back to redistricting news. Just going to talk about two states today. One, the biggest news is I've been kvetching about the fact that in the only states that seem to be overturning gerrymandering are Democratic states. New York, of course, was overturned and it has a map that's much less favorable to Democrats than it would have been. And Maryland had to give up, had to make one of their districts more competitive. Actually, not a huge difference there. But so that brought down to three, maybe if you can argue Oregon's been gerrymandered, two Democratic states that have been gerrymandered. I do not count New Mexico, even though Princeton University says it's gerrymandering because it's been switched to be in the Democrats' favor. But I don't count it gerrymandering when you create additional competitive seats. I'm sorry.
Exactly.
It's when you do that. Same thing in Nevada. They created more seats. But so that leaves it to the Illinois, which has no legal remedy for gerrymandering. They get to gerrymander and it's done. And that is probably one of the most gerrymandered states for the Democrats. And Oregon, again, I find it dubious because what they did was they took a Republican district and they made it competitive. Republicans can still win it. They're going to have to earn it. I don't consider that, but Princeton University considers it the second most gerrymandered state in the country, or second worst. I just don't see that. But a judge, an Obama appointee federal judge, has actually overturned the map in Louisiana. And we've discussed it before. If you go to the 538 site and you go and you hit on the old map and the new map, because they really didn't change the map a whole lot, at least as far as we've talked about this, the 1 out of 6 congressional districts. So let's remember that the black population of Louisiana is about 32%, almost a third, and yet the bulk of them are crammed into one district that extends from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. It's one of those snake districts that just kind of winds through. And if you look at it, you can see it. Baton Rouge and New Orleans should not be in the same district. That happened in 2010, and it should have been declared a Voting Rights Act violation back then. For whatever reason, the lawsuit didn't happen. But now a lawsuit was filed, and a judge, a federal judge, has basically said, no, this map is no good. You got to come up with a new one before the deadline. It has been appealed by the Secretary of State. The governor happens to be a Democrat, is actually calling for a session for drawing another map, and they basically want to say that you need to break that group up into 2 different districts, so that there are 2 black majority districts per the Voting Rights Act, which is to make it proportionate to their communities of interest. So will this happen, or will it get to the Supreme Court in a hurry? Will the Supreme Court say not for this election? I don't, like they've done with other things. I don't know, but there's not a lot of time for that either. They got to get it up in a real hurry, because I believe that the deadline is June 19th, that they have to have a map for the coming election. Dave,
so one thing I would add to this, just for context, is that the Democratic governor that you described, he tried to veto the original map, which was going to maintain that 5 Republican, 1 white district, and Democrats across the aisle to override the veto and keep the system as it was. But that's why that the state had to appeal to the federal court, and they actually won in court. So
what was the motivation of those Democrats? Do you know?
I mean, I'm not the guy to call people out without knowing the details, but that's the last thing I really want to do. But an independent also crossed over. So it's, I think we'll call it heritage, culture, tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, well, anyway, I mean, it's an interesting development. We'll see if it holds. I'm wondering if the timing of the lawsuit wasn't strategic to make it impossible for it to get to the Supreme Court, because it's got to go through. First of all, it's got to get to the appellate court level, circuit court level, and there may not be time to do it. I mean, whoever filed this lawsuit, I think several groups were responsible for it, may have waited for the precise sweet spot time to do this, where all of a sudden, for once, time is on the Democrat side. Well, you got to get this other map up, because you're not going to get to use this. And I believe the court said that if they don't get a map up, they're going to draw it. And courts have done that before.
Yeah.
And
so real quick, it's interesting because this is 6 seats, right? And they represent black folks represent about a third of the state. So the court said, you got to draw 2 districts. You drew this salamander looking thing, which is a textbook gerrymandering. So it should be 2 seats. And then there really will be a constitutional challenge to say, is race one of those things we, fairly consider when apportioning representation? And I don't think the Republicans really want to take that one all the way to the Supreme Court, to be honest, because this seems like a pretty an example that might actually uphold that decision.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that takes us to New Hampshire. Not a lot of racial issues here. It's a pretty white state. But this is the interesting thing, is because I'm not sure I entirely. Basically, what was going to happen is there's 2 congressional districts in New Hampshire, and typically they're both very competitive, and right now the Democrats hold both of them, because even though they're competitive, it's technically speaking, according to 538 criteria, the Democrats that are incumbents have a pretty good rapport with their constituents. So the Republicans wanted to make each district less competitive, concede a district to the Democrats that was not competitive, and then establish a Republican one so that they could break the monopoly and have 1 Republican and 1 Democrat. And they're trying to say it's fair. Isn't it fair that, we have to, you can win the elections. That's how you can do it. But anyway, interesting thing is that the map was vetoed by Republican Governor Sununu. And Sununu is remarkable as a Republican. He is not part of the new guard of hyper-partisan, power for its own sake Republicans. He was considering a run for the Senate. And he decided not to go in, as we reported on this show, not to run for the Senate, because he asked what was on the agenda in terms of what Republicans wanted to accomplish once they retook the Senate. He got blank stares, literally. They had nothing to say. And he says, I'm not going there just to block stuff. I want to go there to make a difference. I can make more difference as governor at home. Well, he's also vetoed this, and because the legislature didn't come up with another one under the New Hampshire law, the New Hampshire Supreme Court adopted a new one that's largely like the old map, competitive for both sides. Chris Pappas is in one that is rated R1 plus 1, pretty much even, and Custer, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, it's D2. These are very competitive districts, probably the fairest in the country. It just happens to be that the 2 Democrats with inertia are incumbents. Maybe someday that'll change. Dave.
This one's really interesting because Senator Sununu, like you said, a moderate Republican, which we thought was a black swan these days, but it's at least some exist. You cited 2 today, David Brooks and Senator Sununu, New Hampshire. Who knew? But this is interesting because the Republicans first tried to have a map that was the most disruptive map they've ever had since the late 1800s, according to 538, which is interesting. But then also they tried to do a second map where both incumbents would be competing against each other in the same district. Mm-hmm. So there was multiple ways that they were just trying to sort of upset the apple cart. Sununu vetoed both, and then came up with his own map where he said he wanted to keep competitive districts because competitive districts keep incumbents accountable. What a novel idea. That's very, that's what he was supporting. But it didn't happen. Legislature wouldn't adapt it, and then so that's where we are. That the Supreme Court instead tried to do the least possible change based on new data, which is consistent with what Sununu was fighting for. So the court sort of endorsed his approach.
So no change in New Hampshire.
Yep.
And Republicans were hoping to gain one. All right, that takes us to our last segment, predictions. All right, Dave, what's your prediction?
So this has to do with the outcome of the January 6th committee hearings. I think that what we've seen and heard from people in the Republican Party about why it's insignificant, unimportant, and people won't pay attention is that it's a show trial, it's a political vendetta, and that they're overextending their mandate. And even if it is a show trial, even if it is a political vendetta, and even if they are overextending their mandate, I think that my prediction is that the narrative with the evidence will combine to what amounts to a reckoning, and that people will be forced, almost like in economics, it's I think called like the fish slap or something, like a fishmonger slaps you in the face with a fish. I think that there's going to be a lot of people who just haven't paid attention. I'm not saying the extreme partisans, but the people who haven't been paying attention are going to see things they've never seen before, hear things they've never heard before, and it's going to be a significant event in our history.
All right, real quickly, this comes back to the California primaries. I've got two predictions. One is the Republicans were really hoping to make an in with the insurance commissioner and the controller to win their first statewide race since 2006 when Schwarzenegger won re-election as governor. It's not going to happen. Democrats are going to have a full slate win, clean sweep in November. Secondly, I am predicting that in California, the Democrats will have a net gain of 3 congressional seats come November, which will go a long ways towards helping them hold on to the House. I think that's still going to be very difficult, but Democrats will get help from California. All right, with that, I want to remind everybody to stay informed and stay engaged. Till next week.